with us today, and I will give you the floor.
Thanks a lot, Cecilia, and thanks, Shaba, for the invitation and everyone for coming on a Saturday morning, afternoon, evening, despite this being a weekend. So in this presentation, I'm going to show the results of the same approach that applied to a few different contexts. So some background that might be in place first. That is the role of social networks in language phenomena. And social networks as natural networks of people who communicate, not to be confused with social networking sites such as, for instance, Facebook or X, that is former Twitter, or other Web 2.0 solutions, have first been investigated, and their importance has been highlighted in the domain of sociolinguistics, primarily in two areas. One, to understand language variation and change, and some seminal studies in that area came already in the 1960s when, for instance, William Labov showed that the language of two competing street gangs in Harlem, or the languages of the gang members, had a lot more in common, even though those gangs were not necessarily adjacent, than the language of the, or the similarities or the distance between the language of the gangs and their neighbors who were not involved in the activities. And then Labov said that, well, the similarities, despite geographic distance, was due partly to a shared system of codes, values, behaviors that were shared across the two groups. And then also waves of other research showed that language, the way we know it and the way it changes, that's a product of the social networks and interactions within the social networks, rather than something that happens randomly. And in sociolinguistics, the role of social networks has also been recognized in investigations of language maintenance and shift, for instance, in families that migrate to other countries, and related phenomena, showing the importance of interactions, for instance, within the home, to the interactions outside, and the language that is going to be picked up, and the one that the children will be productive in. Now, in second language acquisition, social networks have been recognized as well. If you look at current theories of second language acquisition, or SLA, then each of them recognizes the importance of social interaction, as opposed to some earlier theories that would be more purely cognitively oriented and that would be interested in what's going on in the mind of the language user, but not necessarily going outside and looking at the environment in which the language acquisition is taking place. Of course, each of the current theories looks at language acquisition from a slightly different angle. They use different models, different mechanisms, but they do incorporate that social component and see language as the outcome of activities that users engage in, and how the language is shaped by these activities. And this importance of social interaction has nowhere been more important or more recognized in second language acquisition than in study abroad, because that's scenarios where you are shifted out of your primary speech community and you're sort of parachuted or dropped into a new milieu where you need to establish new social ties and contacts with the people on the ground, while being physically removed from people back home. So it's not surprising that for the last 3 decades or so, there have been investigations that would focus on the role of language learners' social circles in this context of study abroad. But most of these studies have focused primarily on interactions with the speakers of the target language, mainly native speakers. So you go abroad to a foreign country, And as a participant in the study, you would be asked by the researcher about your interactions with native speakers of the language that that country uses. But usually researchers were not interested in the learners or students' interactions with speakers of other languages and communication in those languages. And also, the vast majority of the studies existing so far in the last 2 or 3 years have seen a couple studies emerging that were exceptions to the rule, but the vast majority have used an approach where you would, as a participant, you would reconstruct what is called your ego network. So each individual student would be asked to nominate or list the people that they have interacted with, and then maybe provide some information about those interlocutors, etc. But you wouldn't have, as a researcher, information from those people who have been nominated as contacts. So you only had the participant, that is the ego, and their contacts, and that's it. But you wouldn't have reciprocatory information. So that's what our approach tries to do, that is fill that gap by reconstructing full networks of students who are enrolled in intensive language courses during their stay abroad, different kinds of courses, but the common denominator is that all of them are intensive language courses. And we try to reconstruct as complete networks of students as possible. And then within those networks, of course, we focus on interactions with other fellow participants. Why does that make sense? Well, in most of such contexts, at least when the participants have just arrived and have re-enrolled in the language course, the people that they know best and the people that they often spend the majority of their time with are fellow course participants. Because the language course takes half a day usually, and then the rest of the day is free. But if you know the other friends from your course, but not other people, then you're likely to also be spending a lot of out-of-class time with your contacts from class. So that is a sizable proportion of their interactions, and therefore we can look at how that interaction influences progress positively or negatively. So I'm going to focus on 4 different courses and 4 different contexts here. The first one, this study came out in the Modern Language Journal. At the end, I'm going to provide a slide with the references. This study actually got the MLJ Best Paper Award. We're very happy with that. This was the first study that sort of focused in detail on the patterns of social interactions. And here we're looking at a complete group of 39 Erasmus exchange students who go to a German university in order to study their different majors there. Each of them speak a bit of German, but they're also enrolled in a language course. The language course is at 3 different levels of proficiency. And we're looking at those students, how they talk to one another and whether there is any influence between that interaction and their progress. So here you can see that there are a lot of different nationalities. You can also see the students here. And the method that we used was an interview with a questionnaire where the students would see a list of all their classmates. They would have to indicate how often they talked to each other and which languages were used in the communication. And we also have the information about objective progress in the language. So one question that we asked and which showed that this kind of approach makes sense is a very basic question where we listed different activities that the students had access to, which were offered either by the university or that the students engaged in voluntarily. And we asked to what extent the participants thought that involvement in those activities helped with their progress in German. And you can see that those activities that were deemed the most beneficial for progress were at the same time those that involved a lot of hanging out together. So Blaubeuren is an outpost of the university that's essentially in the middle of nowhere in a forest. If you're there, you're just stuck there with the others. Trips, those would be either hikes or bus tours, where again you're going, you always have neighbors in the next seat, and then you typically chat with others. Meetups, the Mensa, group work, theater project, a lot of interaction there. But film screenings, you can see that this got the lowest rating in terms of its utility for language development. And if you're familiar with the system in Germany, then you will be aware of the fact that films in Germany are dubbed. So Morgan Freeman speaks German, Gal Gadot speaks German, everyone speaks German. So if you go to the pictures, then you're surrounded with the language, so you're getting a lot of input. But the students didn't think that that activity was so beneficial. And that may also be because when you go to the pictures, you typically go late in the day because that's the screening time. So you might meet up a little before, maybe for a drink. Then you go, then it's late, you go back home. So you don't really interact that much. And the students didn't think that the film screenings were beneficial. All right, so having information from the questionnaires, we were able to reconstruct the complete networks of the interactions, and then these were weighted networks in that interactions could be more or less intensive, and they were also directed because someone could be talking to others more than vice versa, even though people often expect a symmetry. That is rarely the case. So a reconstructed network may look like this. Here we're looking at a network of all interactions irrespective of the language that was being used. That's why we call it a general network of interactions. Each node on the outer layer is a participant, and then the links mean that they talked to one another. And then we can also look at the network of interactions in the target language only. And here it's a bit similar. It's a bit less dense than the previous one, but as in the previous one, you can see that the links or edges are of different hues or different intensity. It's almost like 50 shades of gray. Actually, there are only 3 here, and we can filter out the weakest ones to get a more transparent picture where we can see that there are some students who are densely connected with others. In complex network theory, they would be called hubs. And then there are some who in this filtered out network are almost isolated or completely disconnected. So there's quite a lot of variation in terms of how often and how much they talk to one another, which is good for research. Now, this information can be overlaid over for other background information, such as the first language of the participants, here indicated by the color, or the progress made over the course of the project, here indicated by the size of the node. So you can see that there are 3 different sizes, and they indicate the progress that was made. So let's look at the relationships or the results between the variables that we were interested in and possible predictors. So one finding, and here we're going to see quite a few box plots in this and the next slides. So a moment for an explanation. Each box plot will show 3 values or 3 columns on the x-axis, 0, 1, 2. 0 will be those participants who haven't made much progress. 2 will be those that have made the most progress. And then 1 are those that made sort of medium progress. And for those in the audience who might be seeing box plots for the first time, you are interested basically in 2 bits of information. The most important one is where the middle line in the box is. That's the median value. So like the average value, but it takes into account the fact that there might be some extremes on either end. So if you were to instead have a bar graph, then the bar would reach more or less where the middle line is. And then the more spread out the box is, the more variation there was in the results, the more squashed the box is, then the more uniform the results were within that subgroup of students. right? And then on the y-axis, the vertical one, you always see the possible predictor. So here what we see is that closeness centrality negatively correlated with improvement. This could be interpreted as it being more beneficial to have fewer contacts than to have many contacts. And that's likely because if you have the same amount of time per day to interact with others, and you have to share it with a lot of people, then let's say you might have an hour for 12 contacts. That means that you have 5 minutes per person. So you won't really go beyond pleasantries and small talk and some basic interaction. You can reuse the same phrases and constructions and vocabulary with every other person. If you have that same hour, but you're sharing it with 3 participants or 3 other course participants, then you have 20 minutes per person. So your interaction is going to be more meaningful, and then you might find that you're going to need more advanced syntactic constructions or vocabulary, and that will be more motivating for progress and interlanguage restructuring. The application of complete networks also allows us to use what is called cluster or community detection. These are unsupervised machine learning algorithms that look at a network and isolate parts where interaction within is statistically much more significantly frequent than elsewhere. So here in this hive plot, we can see 3 branches. There is one in the top left, and you can see that it's not dominated by native speakers of English, primarily American students. And also you can see that this branch is underperforming. So 4 students who made the least progress are on this branch. And then the rest of the branch is practically those that made medium progress. And there's only 1 participant on that branch that really progressed quite a bit. And then there's this smaller, shorter branch in the bottom left, where most of the participants are speakers of Portuguese, not necessarily from Portugal, but also Brazil. And then there's the 3rd branch, the longest one, that doesn't have such a common denominator in terms of the shared language, but you can see still quite a bit of clustering of the languages going on there. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that the language course was offered at 3 levels of proficiency. So we were also interested to see whether the students would be likely to spend their free time interacting with students that they know from their own group, or rather those from one of the other groups. And here we can see that in every case, so that is within each group, the students were much more likely to interact with those who were from one of the other groups rather than the same group. In terms of other predictors of progress, we can see that what mattered for progress was the amount of time speaking the target language, in this case German, but not in terms of absolute values, but in terms of the proportion of time that the target language occupied in your total communication. So to make this a bit more concrete, let's say we have 2 students. One uses German for 1 hour a day and another language for 1 hour a day. And there's another student who uses German for 45 minutes a day and another language for 15 minutes a day. If we just compare the absolute numbers, then it's the first student that's using more German because it's 60 versus 45 minutes. But if we look at the proportions, it's the latter student who's using German more because they're using it for 75% of the time, whereas the first student was using it only for 50% of the time. And in this cohort, it was the latter student who would be making more progress. A finding that might be counterintuitive is that those students who had more incoming interactions in German were actually making less progress. This might be counterintuitive because you might expect that if a lot of people talk to me in German, then I'm getting a lot of input, so I should be learning a lot. But what's probably going on is that this takes place at the expense of the student, because the student is allowing others to actively produce language. And it's through output that your interlanguage can restructure, because you have to consciously think of the constructions that you have to use. Whereas if you're just passively absorbing input, then a lot of input can be processed without really analyzing, for instance, the grammar of the message, but focusing on the vocabulary and the structure. And you might not comprehend the entire sentence, but still get the gist and not necessarily be not motivated enough to make progress. Then in terms of measures that or factors that were not related to the social network, one important predictor was multilingualism. That is, those students who had higher competence in other languages were making much more progress. It's important that this, you can only find this effect if you took the level of proficiency into account and not just counting the number of languages, which is an approach that's still being used even by some researchers in bind multilingualism research. That is, they ask people to list the languages that they can communicate in, but without taking into account the level of proficiency. And there are different ways in which we can count or put a number on multilingualism. One that could be the most straightforward one is if we take the Common European Framework of Reference, and we have 6 levels, C1, C2, from A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, we could assign from 1 to 6 points to those levels. And that's already better than just counting the number of languages spoken, but this ignores the fact that the different levels of proficiency have different capacity, so to say. So it takes a different amount of time to reach them and a different amount of effort. To give you one example, an estimate by the Association of Language Testers of Europe assumes that in order to learn an Indo-European language, if you speak also an Indo-European language, then you need around 95 what is called guided learning hours to reach A1 level from scratch. Guided learning hours is time spent with an instructor, a textbook, a language learning app that gives you formal instruction, and so on and so forth. And that's the same amount of time that you need more or less to move from A1 to A2. But then to move from C1 to C2, you don't need 95 hours, you need around 350 hours. That's almost 4 times as much. So that means that if A1 is going to be worth 1 point and A2 is going to be worth 2 points, then C2 is not going to be worth 6, but actually 12 points. And then the other levels are in between. And that's the best actually measure if you expect multilingualism to play a role. Here's a slide that shows outcomes from our different project. This was a study where we investigated how students and instructors coped with the transition to emergency remote instruction during the COVID pandemic, the first 1.5 waves of the pandemic. And we expected multilingualism to correlate with a few behaviors and perceptions. And we can see that the best correlations were found where we took the level of proficiency into account. So the box plot on the left, that's the worst. And that's just when you count the number of languages. The one in the middle is when you assign 1 point for A1, 6 points for C2, and then the others in between in a linear fashion. And then the box plot on the right is when you take into account the actual more realistic amount of time and effort needed to invest in reaching those levels of proficiency. And we can see that the average is similar, but the box is narrower, so the confidence interval is narrower, meaning that we have more confidence in the result, and that's typically what we're after. So take-home message here would be, if we're looking at multilingualism as a measure, then it's best to take into account how much time and knowledge that level of proficiency actually involves. And then the last measure that we looked at was the time spent interacting with people who share your first language. And we can see expectedly that this is a negative predictor. That is, if you wanted to learn German, but you were hanging out with your compatriots or others who shared your first language, then of course you were using and learning less German. And this is even in cases where participants would say, yeah, I'm a Spaniard and I hang out with Mexicans, but much of the time we were using German because there were other people in the group who didn't speak any Spanish. Even in those cases, we can see that those people didn't really make so much progress. So here's a summary of the results. Again, later there's the reference and the paper is in open access, so you can see them in more detail because we have 3 more contexts at which we can take a look. So a slightly different scenario is intensive summer language courses where the participants are not just students, but from all walks of life. And these are courses that take place at the University of Warsaw every August for 4 weeks, intensive courses of the Polish language and culture. And we look at 2 cohorts from 2 different years. And then we compare them briefly with students who are majors in our institute in applied linguistics to see whether there are similarities and differences. But primarily we focus on the participants in the intensive language course. So here you can see a photo of one of those groups after the Polonaise dance that typically ends each iteration of the course. And the same set of tools, but here we also complemented the tools from the previous research with interviews with all the instructors, as well as with volunteer students. So here are the numbers for the interviews. The same kind of approach, we look at interactions in the target language, we look at interactions overall. Instead of community detection here, because the students were divided into a lot more groups, but smaller groups, typically each year there would be between 120 and let's say 140 students. So they didn't know each other participant, but they were divided into typically between 12 and 18 groups, different levels of proficiency. So they knew at least all their classmates from the groups. And here, what you can see, for instance, if you look at group 11, that's the bottom square in the middle, you can see that it's nicely divided into 2 halves, and that division takes place along first language background lines. So there are 4 students who speak German there, and 4 students who speak Russian there. Those who speak German are not necessarily Germans or Austrians. They're also, for instance, Turks that have been brought up in Germany, but they speak the language. And then Russian is mainly students from the former post-Soviet republics. Actually, none of them is Russian, but it's their lingua franca or sometimes their dominant language. And you can see that they tend to stick together, even though they're of different nationalities. Now, in this study, we looked at a few more measures of centrality. Centrality basically defines how important you are in the network, and there are different ways to calculate importance. So we looked at a few measures to see which of these would be best to predict progress. And we can see that those that were most influential are closeness and degree centrality, which are measures that are responsible for the structure of the network, rather than, for instance, PageRank, which is responsible more for processes such as information flow, for instance, the social diffusion of neologisms or other aspects of linguistic innovation. So this makes sense because in language acquisition, we're not really talking about diffusion of knowledge in the network, but we're looking at other aspects of interaction. And we can see that the centrality metrics mattered most for self-perceived progress in vocabulary and in pronunciation. And this we can also interpret rather easily. The vocabulary that you acquire is going to depend on the input that you get. And that, of course, depends on who you're getting the input from, whether it's more or less highly proficient speakers. And pronunciation, likewise, is going to depend on the models that you're exposed to, but also on your identity. whether you want to learn the other language, but you want to preserve a vestige of your national identity, cultural identity in your pronunciation. And that means that you're also, that first of all, you're not going to try to aim at necessarily acquiring native-like pronunciation, but also it's going to mean that you are likely to be spending more time with your compatriots. Or you might be willing to or trying to pass off for a native speaker in the future. And that means that you're going to be spending more time probably with native speakers and other highly proficient speakers of the language. In terms of other findings, we found that the patterns of interaction with the class teacher correlated with interactions outside of class. So if you interacted with a Polish language teacher in, for instance, English, then you were also more likely to use, for instance, English or other languages in your communication outside of class. We also see expectedly that the degree to which you speak to others is going to be influenced by competence in or proficiency in the language. You know, if you're not very fluent in the language, then there's not much that you can talk about in that language. That's commonsensical. And then we also see that the patterns of interaction with your classmates out of class, they also spill out onto your interaction with other people that are not your classmates, but that are also in Warsaw. As I showed in one of the diagrams, people tended to stay together with people from their own country. And we see that also in the interviews. And we also see that in those cases, the participants would typically switch back into their native language because that was the more natural way of communicating with them rather than a language that they were just learning and that would be more limited and stilted. So the aims here were basically interaction, making friends rather than practicing the language, even though the students were aware of the fact that if they wanted to make more progress in Polish, then they should have been spending more time interacting in that language. So they are aware of that on a declarative level, but they don't walk the walk. And then we also looked at what happened with the course once the pandemic happened. And we find that people who enrolled in the course during the pandemic were much more motivated to learn the language because what went away during the pandemic was that normally when you go to this course, it's not just that you're learning the language, but you're meeting new people, you're getting to know the country, you're getting to enjoy the food. All these attractions are gone when the course is online. So if you sign up for an online course, then the only benefit that you're getting is really learning the language. So you're focused on learning the language rather than joining the course for all the fringe benefits, so to say. And I'm going to skip a few slides in the interest of time in order to focus on two more and show us two more contexts. One that happened last year was the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And that's now in its 10th year, but of course the second part of the war started in 2022. And until today, I only have the statistics from last month, but the number of Ukrainians that had crossed the border into Poland last month was 18.9 million, 18.9. Of course, many have moved on to other countries, many went back to Ukraine, but this means that there are still probably around 1.5 million refugees in Poland, on top of a similar number that had worked in Poland before. So you should estimate between 2 and 3 million Ukrainians living in Poland. And that means that quite a few of them do want to learn the Polish language. And there's an offer directed at that group specifically. So here if we look at the literature on language learning by refugees, Then most of the literature focuses on affective and emotional aspects, as well as the barriers to integration and the benefits of language knowledge to integration, specifically in the language, in the context of Polish language learning by Ukrainians. There have been a few studies, but they were more in the structuralist tradition, trying to list the errors that Ukrainian students make learning Polish. And there has been a little on pragmatic and intercultural pedagogy, but not really much literature on the more sociolinguistic aspect. So that's what we did here. Here again, we used a questionnaire like we used before. You can see the Ukrainian language version. As a class participant, you would see all the names of your classmates. Here, the first name and the surname are blanked out for privacy purposes. So you can only see the middle names. And then you are going to indicate who the more frequent initiator of the interactions was, the frequency of the interactions, and the languages, the percentage of languages spoken. 3 different courses, all at a university in the northwest of Poland. What's important is that this is not your typical student participant group. Here, the average age of the participants was 35. And also many only had primary education finished. And also for many, this was the first really academic study where they would have to fill out a questionnaire. So we needed to be able to explain quite a lot of questions that had never come up in the other groups. If you look at some other interesting statistics here, more than 80% claimed that their first language was Ukrainian, and around 17% that their first language was Russian, but we're going to see that that's not the full picture. The participants came from all over the country. The more southeast their origin, the more likely they were to be dominant in Russian. But most of them were bilingual. So we were interested to see whether dominance in Russian versus Ukrainian would influence progress. Because one of the languages is closer, one of them is further away from Polish. Now, if you were to measure the distance between Ukrainian and Polish and Russian and Polish, the best known source among Slavic linguists is Tyshenko. And here, the languages of interest are the 3 biggest nodes. So at the top, you can see Polish, then at the top right, Ukrainian, and bottom right, Russian. So you can see that the distance between Polish and Ukrainian is smaller than between Ukrainian and Russian, and then between Polish and Russian. And this is what most naive users of Polish would tell you, those who do not know or know just a little bit of Ukrainian and Russian, that they are finding it easier to communicate in Ukrainian than in Russian. And that would be a perception that's not influenced by the war. That was also my impression when I visited or when I was delegated to Ukraine as a representative IATF Poland in 2006 or 2008. I was sent to Donetsk. And without knowing Russian then, because now I speak some Russian, I was able to understand a lot more Ukrainian than Russian, irrespective of the writing system, right? So that's what the best known Slavic source tells you, and what naive speakers tell you as well. But you can also see other databases and other measures here. One by Søren Wichmann that uses the LDND database and normalized Levenshtein distance. And here you can see that in the dendrogram, that the distance between Polish, that's in the middle of the tree, and Ukrainian, more to the bottom, is longer, so further away, than the distance between Polish and Russian. Right, and you can see that Russian is closer to Ukrainian here. So we can get different measures depending how you count the distance, but either way, we can see that there are differences. So we might expect there to be a difference in progress. Well, in our study, there wasn't any. With 251 participants, we didn't find any effect of the background language. We ran a simulation that told us that in order to find an effect, we would need a sample of around 1,000, and even then the effect would be small. But there were nonetheless differences. So those who were dominant in Russian were often concealing that fact in the first questions of the survey. So here in the Venn diagram, you can see in the sort of bottom left the 27. That's 27 participants who say that their first and dominant language is Ukrainian. But then if you look at further questions which ask about their interactions with their family and others, they're all practically always using Russian, right? You can also see that that Russian dominant participants have lower centrality in the peer contact network. So here you can see one example. Here's one class group. The yellow nodes are those that are dominant in Ukrainian. The red nodes are those that are dominant in Russian. The white ones are sort of balanced. And you can see that the Russian dominant participants are on the periphery of the network. Remember, this is a reconstruction of the graph from the reports of all the participants. So it's not that the Russian-speaking participants felt ostracized. This is actually reflected in all reports. And we can also see that the Russian dominant participants interact less with speakers of Polish. So this behavior also spills out a little beyond the classroom, and they show more barriers in integration. Now I'm going to skip a few slides, look at the significant predictors. And here, one that was a very strong predictor in terms of objective progress was the length of stay in Poland. And here it was a negative relationship. That is, the longer you had stayed in Poland before enrolling in the course and then taking the final test, the smaller your progress. And this may be the effect of, you could say, a ceiling effect to some extent. So those participants who had spent a lot of time in Poland prior to enrolling in the language course, they had already made some progress by exposure. So then they were relatively higher in terms of proficiency. And the higher you are in terms of proficiency, the less easy it is to show that you've made progress, right? Then if you're starting from a very low level. And there are also some other interesting findings. For instance, those participants who had taken the course after arriving in Poland 85 days earlier or shorter time, they showed very distinct patterns in terms of which of the skills were difficult for them to acquire and which were easy. So you could see that they found reading and cultural knowledge to be quite easy to acquire, or they were seen as making fast progress in these domains, and then low progress or slow progress in the domain of grammar and writing, which is not counterintuitive, it's quite expected. But then those who had spent more time in Poland, and their results are all over the place, right? Probably again because they had the time to acquire the sort of basic competences, so now they were starting to develop the others. And then there were some other findings that were interesting, but I'm going to skip them to focus on the last project, which is to us most exciting because it includes a dynamic longitudinal component. Because in the previous studies, we only had 2 points of measurement. So we would measure proficiency at the beginning of the course and then proficiency at the end of the course. And we'd ask about the social network at the end of the course. Here, we're taking a few steps where we measure behavior. So we're looking at an intensive program for Arabic that's organized by a university in the United States. 41 students go to Amman for 3 months. They also already speak some Arabic, but at different levels of proficiency. Here we can see the group. So that's the students with their instructor in the Wadi Rum Desert. And this is Amman, a city that's organized slightly differently than in many countries that we're used to, but it offers a lot of exposure to Arabic if you want to gain that exposure. So I'm going to jump straight into the results because I'm going to be mentioning the research questions in the results. So given that we were asking the participants after every month to tell us about the communication that they had with each other in the course out of class. So for each student, we were asking about their communication with the 40 remaining students. And we were also measuring progress objectively from the starting point to the end point, and then also subjectively after every month, also looking at the specific scales. Because the objective measurement, that was an oral proficiency interview, it just gives you one score. It's a holistic measure, so you cannot tell from that how much progress was made, for instance, in writing, because that measure that doesn't include writing. And it doesn't really include a breakdown into, for instance, vocabulary, grammar, pragmatic competence, and so on. So looking at the social networks, we find that the social networks are fairly stable over the 3 months. And we find a lot of what is called homophily, gender homophily, that is female participants tend to interact with other female participants, male participants with other male participants. There's not a lot of interaction going on across the genders. So to explain, because there's a lot of information encoded here, each node is a student. The lines between nodes indicate communication. Arrows indicate who was reporting that communication, that is speaking to whom. Circles denote female participants. Octagons denote male participants. So you can see that females talk to females, males talk to males. The color of the outer edge of the node indicates accommodation that was in the same house. That didn't have to be the same apartment, but basically the same house. Sometimes it was the same apartment. The size of the node indicates progress made, and then the shade of the node inside indicates starting proficiency. You can also see 4 ellipses there. So what's characteristic of that university is that this is a Mormon university. So actually there were a few students who were married couples, and then there were some that were dating or engaged. So you can see, for instance, in the top right, 19 and 29, they are married, they practically don't speak to each other. Right? And then if you look at the second month, the third month, then this is basically the same people hanging out together, sometimes sort of narrowing their interaction. All right, so let's look at what correlated with progress. In this slide, we're looking at self-reports. In the next slide, at objective progress. So in self-reports, we see that between the centrality negatively correlated with how the students saw themselves in terms of their Arabic proficiency in comparison with others. This may be because they were exposed to more other contacts. That means that they were probably a little better able to position themselves, knowing that, all right, he's this good and she's this good. So this allows you to calibrate a little better or more realistically. But it also positively correlated with self-reported improvement in reading, maybe because the students might have been recommending, for instance, readings to one another. And then there are some findings that are in gray font, because those are findings that we find as significant only in one of the months of the sojourn, but not across all the months. Then vote rank, another measure of importance, negatively correlates with writing. And this is, again, commonsensical. For once, writing is not a priority for most of the students who go on a study abroad sojourn. Mostly, if they want to develop their linguistic competence, they want to do so in terms of speaking, listening, interaction, cultural knowledge. not so much writing. Writing you can practice at home. So this is not unexpected. And then we also find that in the last month, there was a positive relationship between the clustering coefficient and self-perceived progress in pragmatic knowledge and in listening. In terms of pragmatic knowledge, this might be the effect of a safe bubble where you are able to discuss with others how your interactions with the locals came out. And the others gain knowledge through that without necessarily being exposed to face-threatening acts themselves, right? So you're learning sort of second-hand or through that. And then listening might also be due to the fact that it might be easier to listen to non-native speakers whose pronunciation might be closer to yours than to native speakers, but this is a speculation. Now, in terms of objective progress, that is progress from pre-departure to post-departure proficiency, we find that there's a negative relationship between progress and the initial proficiency in Arabic. This shows again what we saw earlier, that is, it's easier to show that you've made progress if you started out at low levels of proficiency, and it's increasingly difficult to show progress in the same amount of time if you're at higher levels because you're already quite close to ceiling. Expectedly and luckily, we find a positive correlation between progress and use of Arabic out of class. That's what we would want. And also expectedly negative correlation between progress and the level of interaction with classmates from your home university. Because if you were spending a higher proportion of your time with your US classmates, then you were spending less time with speakers of Arabic. And also negative correlation between progress and perception of group integration. This is basically sort of goes hand in hand with the previous one. And then again, a few points that were only found in specific months. All right, so then we tried to fit the predictors into a regression to find which were the most important one that could explain objective progress. And here we find 4 in the model that are influential. And these are in order of importance. So we're looking at dominance weight. That's typically the best variable in terms of showing importance or relative importance. So you can see that the most important was pre-sojourn proficiency in Arabic. Then perception of group integration. And these 2 were negatively influential, right? And then positively, we can see the influence of in degrees, one of the centrality metrics, as well as competence in other languages, right? So the degree of multilingualism, which we could also see in the first study that I started off with. And this explains as much as 46% of variance in the outcomes. Of course, we need to remember that this was not a very big group. Now, in terms of dynamic changes, that is changes from month to month, we found that the last month was quite special because you could see a dip in the use of target language out of class, the time spent learning the language, as well as perception of interaction with classmates. This is something that's reported elsewhere in the study abroad literature, because students typically find that they only have a limited number of days in the country, and there are still so many things that they want to do and try and see. So language learning takes second place. So you can see this drop in the amount of target language use in the 3rd month, drop in the amount of time spent learning the language in the last month. Also, less time spent with classmates because maybe you interact with locals, or maybe you interact with other interactants. In terms of those values that increased, we can see a steady increase in the perception of group integration. Again, logical. You've been spending so much time with the others that you've been getting to know them better. In terms of other dynamic changes, we can see that reading or improvement in reading was seen as highest in the first month, and the same about in terms of vocabulary. This may be the effect of sudden immersion in Arabic. So of course, all the students had known the language beforehand, but now, but usually when they were back in the US, they had that exposure through course materials and maybe online. Now suddenly you can see Arabic everywhere in the streets, in the newspapers. You hear it a lot as well, but you're definitely seeing it in the linguistic landscape. And then in the second month and the third month, you're also seeing that, but it's already had time to normalize. Listening improved in last month. Here we had a mistake, and the first questionnaire for the first month didn't include the listening, so we have one data point missing. And in terms of grammar, we can also see that improvement in grammar was seen as highest in last month. This may be a delayed effect of instruction. If you're learning vocabulary, you can learn a word and start using it immediately. In order to start using grammatical construction or rule and to automatize and proceduralize it, it takes a little longer than that. And then we can see that centrality metrics were dropping significantly over time, this irrespective of the metric taken across most of them. And this is again congruent with findings in the literature that show that initially students start out with larger networks and then prune them to end up with fewer contacts. And the last research question concerned potential differences in gender. So here we can see that the female participants were spending much more time in terms of the proportion of time communicating with other US students. And that to some extent, this could have been due to the fact that they were more likely to share accommodation with more female students than the males with more male students. But there's also the importance of the cultural influence there. The female students are advised if they want to go out in the evening or generally after dark to only do that in a group which will have a male participant in the group. Of course, males weren't subjected to such a restriction. So it often meant that the female students didn't necessarily have someone to go out with, so they were essentially stuck at home. So here we see this importance of the local context. We also see in terms of gender differences that the male students on average were starting out with higher proficiency in Arabic, and they were more proficient in other languages. And we can see that is a factor that of course influenced progress. But subjectively, it was the female participants that felt that their level was relatively higher than that of the classmates. If you're interested in this last paper, this is a study that's going to appear in the autumn or late summer, but most likely autumn special issue of Language Learning that's devoted to study abroad. There are a few other exciting papers on study abroad in that issue. And the paper is after a revision, and I know that the reviews are accepted minor revision. I just haven't received it yet. So if you're interested in having a look before it goes to print, then you can do it here. And then if you're interested in the other studies, then the three of them, except for the Ukrainian project, because that one is still being written up. These are all in open access, and you can access them at the links highlighted here. So thanks a lot for listening, and if we have time for comments or questions, then I'll be happy to take them, or criticism, or any other remarks. Thank you.